Hi, my name is Nick Darty, retired sergeant from the Grand Prairie, Texas Police Department, and welcome to Building Financial Strength in First Responder Families. It's an honor to have you here today to go through the premier financial wellness training taught by first responders for first responders. And before we get started today, I really want to go through a couple of important questions. You know, it's kind of crazy. How many of you watching right now sign up for this job to be a cop, a firefighter, dispatcher, whatever part of first responder land you're in? How many of you signed up for this job and said, man, I just signed up for a job that's going to make me a millionaire? So for those of you that need a couple minutes to stop laughing, right, we don't get into this job to become millionaires. But the crazy thing is that we actually do. Every single one of you watching right now technically is a millionaire. You see, you are playing the biggest game of your entire life. You play it every single day. It's called the game of money. And if you take the money you started earning the very first time you took your very first job till the day you die, almost every single one of you watching this is going to earn somewhere between 3 and 5 million pieces to the game that we call money. And if you just found out that you're going to have $3 to $5 million flow through your hands over the course of your entire life, it's what you do with those pieces that dictate whether you retire broke or you retire a millionaire. But we got to get some baggage out of the way first. You see, there are no excuses. It doesn't matter where you've been. It only matters where you're going. We've all done stupid things with money, right? That's what makes us adults, right? We've all done stupid stuff. It's just a matter of how many zeros are at the end of it. But we all have the ability to look forward and change, because it doesn't matter what we've done in the past. It's how we learn from those mistakes that make us stronger. And you see, if you're not where you want to be financially, emotionally, physically, spiritually, socially, 10 times out of 10, it's because you've settled for a place called convenience. And that's kind of part of this entire wellness movement we see in first responder land. You see, finances are a pivotal part of the role when it comes to wellness within our space. Everybody talks about the mental aspect of things, the physical, the fitness, but we've got to start looking at the financial wellness aspect of things. Now, before I get too far into the weeds, I do want to make sure you understand that there is no such thing as a cookie cutter approach when it comes to finances, right? Everybody's financial situation is different. And for some of you, I'm going to talk about things today that's going to be very close to home. It's going to make a huge impact. For some, I may talk about some subjects that don't apply to you whatsoever, right? There's all kinds of different opinions out there when it comes to financial wellness, right? You've got the Dave Ramseys of the world. You've got the Susie Ormans. You've got the Grant Cardones and Robert Kiyosaki's. Our job is to take all these different components and find what works best for us. Now, one thing you got to understand about money, it's not your salary that makes you rich. It's your spending habits that make you rich. Over the course of my career being involved in finances after I left law enforcement, I've got to work with the gamut, right? I work with people that have hardly any income, making less than $30,000 a year. I work with chiefs of police and city managers making $200,000, $300,000, $350,000 a year. And ironically, over the years of working with this vast range of people who make vast ranges of salaries, an interesting trend has come about. You see, the millionaires that I typically talk to, almost every single one of them is a line-level first responder. We're talking about sergeants, line-level cops, drivers, line-level firefighters, EMS. Heck, I know a records clerk that's never made more than about $30,000 a year on average for her annual income that has over $850,000 sitting in her city deferred comp account. Right? It obviously wasn't the salary that made her rich. It was her spending habits that made her rich. So let's kind of qualify how I became known as the expert when it comes to financial wellness in our industry. You see, I did not get my degree in finance. When it comes to money, I got a PhD in doing stupid stuff with money, which again kind of qualified me. I always joke as a rookie when I came into law enforcement. And you got to go all the way back to my days in high school. I grew up in a town called Irving, the city of Irving. I was on the south side of Irving, which was not the nice side of Irving, by the way. And I had a phenomenal childhood. My dad's a paint contractor. My mom worked in the retail industry, and they worked their butts off to make sure that me and my sister had everything we could have ever wanted. But we didn't exactly live a life of luxury, right? We didn't go on luxury vacations. I didn't get the fancy clothes. And so I learned about money because when it was time for me to get my first car, I went to my parents and said, I'd like a car. And my dad looked at me and said, that's nice. Go get a job. And so I did. I went and got a job working at a grocery store, bagging groceries and working in the produce department. And I started saving up my money to buy my first car. And as you can imagine, back in the mid-1990s, working at a grocery store, you weren't making a whole lot of money, which means your first car was a beauty, right? And so the first love of my life was a 1989 silver Ford Festiva. Yeah, she's a beauty, isn't she? I like to call this my bubble on roller skate wheels because that's about what it looks like. Now, I was one of those stupid kids that liked to put stuff in my car that was worth more than the car. And so what do you need a back seat for when you can throw some speakers back there? I actually had a girlfriend at the time that made me a plaque that said Basing Bubbles because that's about what I look like coming down the road. Well, it came time for my senior year, and the senior trip was being put on to Cancun, Mexico. And I went to my parents and I said, can I go? And they kind of challenged me. And they said, yeah, if you can afford to save for it, we're not paying for it. And I did. I started working a bunch of overtime at the grocery store, and before you knew it, I had enough money to go on my senior trip. So I went down to Mexico, and I had a blast. I mean, what kid doesn't have fun in Cancun, right? I got back from Cancun, and I did the status quo thing. I registered to go to college at a junior college called Northlake, and before I could even get to my first class, I got bombarded with credit card offers. Why? Well, you got to go back to a concept that we've really studied heavily, and that's marketing of debt. There's really two things that I've really studied extensively since getting involved in this movement. The first is millionaires. I've read just about every study I can get my hands on with millionaires because I want to know how they operate. What do they do? How do they become successful? And the statistics about millionaires are pretty interesting because what you think they do and how they live is not really how they live, and we're going to go over those later on in the class. But the second thing I studied extensively was marketing of debt. I mean, let's face it, debt is a multi-billion-dollar company, right? They are selling us a product. And there's a huge concept in the debt world and really in all of marketing called brand loyalty. And that's why they want to get us hooked on credit cards right out of high school. It's not because we're dumb. It's not because we're naive. It's because they know that if they can get you to sign up for that very first credit card, there's a very good chance you will do business with that brand of credit card for the rest of your life. Statistically speaking, if your first credit card was a Visa, there's a very good chance you may have never, ever owned a Discover or a MasterCard or even an American Express card. You'll stick with that Visa card for the rest of your life. I mean, how many of us live in families where if you got caught in a Chevy, you would be killed, right? Because your parents are diehard Ford drivers or vice versa, right? We get that brand loyalty and we get stuck on our ways with that. So, of course, I walked into college, got my first credit card, which was a Visa, started using it, and two things happened real quickly. I went into debt and I built a credit score, which was the next money lesson. Because I quickly learned that if you have a credit score, you can go out and finance a car. You don't have to drive a bubble anymore. Because to be honest, it was a little embarrassing to drive around town in a bubble. And so I went to a car dealership and I qualified for my next car, which was a 1993 Honda Civic Coupe. A little bit cooler of a car. And so I quickly got into the car, started enjoying it, but I missed my stereo system, so I decided to drop $2,000 in stereo equipment into this car. I had so much fun my first year in Mexico, I went back. And when I get back from that trip, I got a call from the VP of sales for the company that was selling those senior trips. And he said, hey, Nick, we don't have anybody selling senior trips in North Texas. Would you be interested? Oh, by the way, if you come work for us, you get to go live in Cancun, all expenses paid, for 2 months out of every summer. I don't know a lot of 19-year-olds that aren't going to jump on that opportunity. So I literally quit my job at the grocery store on a Monday, dropped out of college on the same day, flew to California Thursday to learn how to sell stuff because I'd never sold anything. Came back home on Sunday and moved out of my parents' house on Friday, right? Talk about jumping off a cliff. And I was pretty decent at selling senior trips. So decent that in 1999, at the age of 19, I was being paid $48,000 a year plus commission on top of that. I actually took a pay cut when I became a cop. Now, I don't tell my personal story to brag. I tell my personal story to illustrate a point, because what happens when you hand a kid that's used to not having a bunch of money $48,000 a year plus commission? Yeah, you guessed it. We start doing stupid stuff on steroids. And my story is no different than what we're doing to most first responders in this country. I mean, if you think about it, we're hiring these first responders, 21, 22, 23 years of age. We're paying them more money than they've ever made in their entire life. We give them access to unlimited overtime. And what do you think they're going to do, right? The same thing I did. I got introduced to a bunch of money and a salary, and I started doing stupid stuff on steroids. Well, again, did some self-reflecting and said, man, that Civic's a nice car, but it's not $48,000 salary cool car, right? I got to get me a bigger car that represents my salary and my status in America, right? So I got rid of this car and I bought me a nice little 2001 Honda Accord Coupe. And of course, using my credit cards, I dropped about $5,000 worth of stereo equipment into this car. Starting to see a little bit of a theme, aren't you? And I thought I had a really cool car stereo until I walked into a national competition being held at Dallas Market Hall one year. And I walked in and saw these national competing cars, scratched my head and said, wow, my car sucks compared to these cars. And I caught the bug. I decided that I wanted to compete on that national level. Now, I didn't want to compete in how loud you make your car. I wish I had done that because it's actually pretty cheap to throw a bunch of speakers in a car and make it loud. I wanted to compete in sound quality. How realistic can you make your car sound? So the year before I became a cop, I dropped my car off at the car audio shop, said rip everything out, start from scratch. And when I get back from Cancun, I want to have one of the top 10 cars in the nation when it comes to sound quality. Went down to Mexico. Learned a really cool, fun new game. It's called the Credit Card Shuffle. You know what I'm talking about. Need some extra money? Get you another credit card. 0% transfer balance for the first 6 months and load the first one back up. And I had to do that 3 times while I was in Mexico. Why? Because I got back home after spending 2 months and my competitive car audio system came with a price tag of $21,000. Yeah, that's right. $21,000 in one car stereo. You're seeing a couple of pictures of the car. I had 17 speakers in this car, and you couldn't see any of them. Right? I demoed satellite radio before it came out practically. Right? I'm not telling this story to brag because this was the single stupidest thing I ever did when it comes to money. It was always kind of interesting when I'd pick up a girl on a date because they thought I was doing the chivalry thing by opening the door for them, and I was to a certain extent, but I had ulterior motives. I had to make sure to tell that girl, hey, do me a favor, when you get in my car, please don't put your foot through that $900 speaker in the floorboard, right? The box it's in is also $900. That's $3,600 sitting in my floorboard. And again, the single stupidest thing I ever did when it comes to money. So I become a cop, make it through the academy, make it through training, which is the important part, right? Because after you make it through the academy and training, what can you do now? You can work overtime. And I started working overtime like crazy. Right? See, I'm very fortunate. In Grand Prairie, we have a program that allows us basically to work up to 27 hours of overtime every single week. And I was taking advantage of that. I was working overtime like crazy. I was working one day, got off duty, was on my way home, and I realized I kind of had a problem with the car because I started to notice that every time the bass hit in this car, the lights were starting to dim a little bit. Cars aren't designed to have this much power run through them. And over the next couple of months, it was progressively getting worse and worse. And I realized that I had probably destroyed the electrical system in my car. The crazy thing is that I was also $7,000 upside down on the balance of my car. So here I am upside down on my car. I've now spent over $30,000 on stereo equipment across all of my cars. And I have to rip the stereo out, which means I have no stereo anymore, which there goes that $30,000. And I'm so far upside down. What am I going to do? I kind of had a panic moment. But a buddy of mine said, you should go to Grand Prairie Ford because they take care of us Grand Prairie cops, right? I mean, every single one of you watching these has a car dealership close to you that gives first responders good deals on new cars, right? Even though they're not really good new deals, right? We'll talk about that later on. And so I went to Grand Prairie Ford and I said, hey, I got a problem. I'm $7,000 upside down on the balance of my car, but I'd like to get me a newer car. So, of course, he goes and runs my credit, comes back with this big old grin, which should have been my first warning sign. And he says, don't worry about being $7,000 upside down, brother. We'll just roll that balance in the next car. I said, really? He goes, yeah, we do it all the time. What kind of car would you like? I said, man, that yellow Mach 1 Mustang was pretty. So I bought me a sports car. Now, here I am, a rookie with a badge and a gun. How do you think I drove this bad boy? Yeah, I drove it like I stole it. And I quickly realized there's a reason they replace the brakes and tires on our squad cars every 6 months. Except for when you drive your sports car like you drive your squad car, you got to pay for that yourself. And so I quickly realized that this was a pretty expensive endeavor. And about this time, I met this gorgeous girl named Carrie. And I realized that Carrie was probably going to be the one I was going to marry. And I thought, maybe it's time for me to kind of reevaluate things. And maybe I should go get me a grown-up car. So I decided to go back to the dealership to play the game. Now, mind you, $7,000 upside down on the first car. I'm now several $1,000s upside down on the Mustang. And the dealership said, hey, before you play the game of buying your next car, let me tell you about a really cool, fun new game that allows you to buy a new car. And actually, wasn't even buying it, rent a new car for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, you get to go in and trade it in and get you another brand new car and rent the next car for 3 years. They actually lied to me at the time. They said, this is how wealthy people drive cars. Millionaires use this strategy. Well, now that I've studied millionaires, we know that's not true, right? I mean, the millionaires don't even buy brand new cars, much less lease cars. And that's what I did. I got roped into leasing my next car. Now, I didn't lease any car. I leased a fully loaded $36,000 Acura TL. I want you to remember that car. We're going to come back to that. I basically had fallen victim to the FTO starter pack, right? This is what we do in first responder land, right? We get out of the academy, or heck, during the academy, we buy the truck and the cars, right? We get a rifle, we get a tattoo, we date a nurse, a teacher, or a dispatcher. The dispatchers give us the most problems, right? Sorry, dispatchers. You know how that goes. And we're broke, right? We're just flat broke. You see, I was starting to get tired. And I had to reach that pivotal point where I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. I remember I got home one night. I was exhausted. It was about midnight. I wasn't exhausted because I worked my shift in patrol. I was exhausted because I did my 5 hours of overtime before I even started my shift. And I knew I had to get up the next day and go do the exact same thing over again. And I'd kind of worked myself into a situation where if I didn't work about 20 hours of overtime every single week, I could no longer pay my bills. And that's really scary in our industry, because in our industry, it's not a matter of if, it's when you get injured. How much overtime can you work when you're on light duty? I felt like I was in the rat race, running this kind of circle, trying to keep my head above water. On the outside, everybody thought I looked like a very successful young adult. I had nice cars, nice toys. I was going on nice vacations. I had a gorgeous luxury apartment that I wasn't paying for because I was a courtesy officer, obviously. But on the inside, I was dying because I was exhausted. I remember I walked over to my kitchen table that night, and on my kitchen table was a stack of bills, and it was that night that for the first time I decided to add up all my bills. And it was that night that I realized that I dug myself a hole that was $80,000 in debt deep. $80,000. And the scary thing is that Carrie's title had already officially changed. It was no longer girlfriend, it was fiance. And I kind of forgot to tell her this little bit of important information. So I had to go sit across the table from the girl I wanted to marry and explain to her the guy she wanted to marry was $80,000 in debt. Want to take a guess at how much debt Carrie had? She was debt-free. But I looked at her, I said, Carrie, don't worry, I got a plan. And she looked at me back with this look and she said, you better. She said, I was very lucky. When I got released from training, my beat partner was a 20-year vet that became one of my best friends, still is to this day. And he was that cop that would go car to car with the young rookies and pound financial wellness into their head. I got introduced to the Dave Ramsey program, and I fell in love with Dave's principles of how to complete what's called a debt snowball and accelerate paying your debt off to work towards becoming debt-free. And I told Carrie that I was going to commit to her that night that I was going to pay off all $80,000 in debt before we got married. So for the next 24 months, I worked about 1,000 hours of overtime. And on March 3rd, 2007, we got married. 100% debt-free. Everything but the house at the time. This March, it'll be 17 years of marriage for me and Carrie. It's been 17 years since we've had a balance on a credit card. 17 years since we've had a car payment. 17 years of complete freedom when it comes to being in consumer debt. And that's how this movement started for me. I became the money nerd at my department. Fast forward to 2011, we got a new chief named Steve Dye, and Steve Dye started a police academy at our agency, and he says, hey, I want you to design a class to start teaching our rookies about how to start being financially well. Ended up getting asked to teach the entire department, and next thing you know, we were being asked to teach all over the place, and that's ultimately why I gave up my sergeant stripes and retired to do this on a full-time basis. It has truly become an honor to become the voice of financial wellness, again, having now taught over 30,000 first responders from over 3,000 agencies nationwide. And that's how this movement started. So let's shift. Now you know how I learned about money and how we kind of became the expert on this. Let's talk about the why. Why are you even here, right? Well, we're here because we got to start normalizing talking about money. Right? We don't talk about money amongst ourselves. Why? It's a taboo subject, right? I mean, if you're really good with your money, you don't want anybody else to know that you're wealthy, right? Because then everybody expects you to buy lunch every day. If you're not very good with your money, you're irresponsible. Nobody wants to be known as the irresponsible thing. But think about the stress that it causes on us on the job, right? In a very large study of employees across this country, 66% responded that they stress about debt at least once a week while they're at work. 60% of us stress about being able to save enough for retirement. Right? 51% of us stress about whether we can pay our children's education. Here's a scary one. 48% stress about whether or not they can make their basic living expenses. Can they even make their next mortgage payment? 36% whether they can pay for medical expenses. I mean, think about your department right now, especially if you work in a big major city department. We all have a grumpy on a shift, right? That cop that is just miserable. They can't stand to be there. And how much of us look at that grumpy and recognize that one of the reasons they're grumpy is not because they hate this job, it's because they didn't do what they needed to do to be able to save and be able to retire or take care of their kids' education. And they're stuck there in a job because of those past decisions. And we got this way in America because, frankly, this picture pretty much represents what a lot of financial household situations look like. We scratch our head and we wonder why we can't get any traction when it comes to money. Well, it's really hard to run when there's no feet on the ground. We overload our donkeys constantly. How do we get that way in this country? Well, 2/3 of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, right? Most of us are living paycheck to paycheck in this country. And that's scary. I think our first responders are even worse. I think that number is actually higher for us. Why? I mean, is anybody worried about being laid off right now? I mean, very rarely do you see a situation where first responders are laid off, right? We got a government job. For my cops, dispatchers, detention, we can't find enough people to do this job right now because of the issues that we see going on in America with the attack on our industry. And so who cares if we live paycheck to paycheck? That check's going to hit my inbox every couple weeks. The scary part about that is that 60% of us, we don't keep a budget, even though 53% of us are financially anxious. The one thing that would help us with the anxiety when it comes to money is the one thing we don't want to do, which is that budget. We're going to spend an entire section talking about that one alone. This one's scary. 66% of Americans would struggle to pay for a $1,000 emergency. We don't keep any money in the savings accounts, right? And the scary part about that is that 8 out of 10 of us watching this right now are going to experience a $5,000 whoopsie every 10 years. Something's going to happen. Kid's going to break a leg and there's going to be out-of-pocket max medical that year, right? There's going to be a hailstorm or a fire or some kind of a natural disaster that causes us to have to write a big old check for our deductible for the roof replacement or the car, right? Something's going to happen. And I want you to think back to the last time you had a financial emergency. Was it the event that caused the stress or was it trying to figure out how to pay for the event that caused the stress? It's usually the latter, right? Most Americans rely on credit cards and debt to cover their emergencies. We rely on institutions that rob us of our greatest wealth building tool, our income, in the form of interest of 20% plus on a credit card now, all because we just didn't prepare for it. Right? 43% of Americans spend more money than we earn. All you got to do is look at the parking lot of your police or fire department to know that one, right? We spend a whole lot of money to impress people at stoplights we're never going to meet. Financial problems directly relate to your stress levels, right? I mean, for my law enforcement folks, this is even more important because we have one of the 5 most stressful careers in the country right now. And you throw money problems into the mix, along with a stressful job, right? That's a recipe for disaster. Financial problems are oftentimes ranked as the number one cause of fights and divorce in a marriage, right? 50% of our couples nationwide end up in divorce. What's that divorce rate for first responders? Depending on what study you look at, it can be anywhere from 60 to 75%, right? I mean, you know the old saying, you're not really truly a first responder until you've been divorced once or twice, right? I hate that terminology too, by the way. We normalize divorce in our industry. And I get it. If you got to get divorced, you got to get divorced. But we shouldn't be pre-programming these rookies by telling them 100 times in the academy that you're not really truly a cop or a dispatcher or detention unless you've been divorced once or twice. Right? Crazy thing is the two most likely times that marriage is in a divorce, it's approximately 2 years into the marriage and years 5 through 8, which is ironic because for first responders, one of the biggest first burnout phases of our career occurs in that same 5 to 8 year window. Higher morale, which leads to higher work production, lower stress levels. I always joke and say the bars and stars and the gold badges, the executive level first responders, they love this one. But the reality is, if you're a financially fit first responder, you will be a safer first responder. Yeah, I said it. This is a safety class. I know the connotation that comes along when you start throwing that out there, but it's true. When I promoted to sergeant at my department, I was a 9-year-old baby. So here I am, 9 years of service with sergeant stripes on my shoulder, and I was promptly rewarded by being placed on the 30-year veteran shift. So 9 years of service supervising men and women that have 3 times the experience that I do. And I remember one of the first things my lieutenant told me was, he goes, "Hey, Nick, here's your first assignment. These are your problem children. Go fix them." And at the time at my department, problem child was defined as these are my officers that sit under shade trees and don't do a damn thing all day long. All they do is sit there. Figure out how to get them to do something and get them to work, Nick. What I quickly realized is that for one of my problem children, it wasn't that he didn't want to work. He was just flat exhausted. By now, we're on 12-hour shifts. So he would get to work at 6 a.m., he'd get off at 6 p.m., complete his 12 hours of service. He'd do 4 hours of overtime to complete 16 hours because that's the most you could do in a 24-hour cycle. And he lived 90 minutes away. So you do the math. How much sleep was he getting? Right? It wasn't uncommon for him just to stay in the quiet room or sleep in his truck, right? Just to make sure he got the briefing on time. The next thing is helping prepare your family if the worst occurs, right? I'm not trying to scare anybody in here, but we're all going to die. And we do a piss poor job of preparing our family for that day. We don't do will and estate planning. We don't do legacy planning. That section's so important that we're going to spend an entire module talking about this. But this is the real reason I'm here today. It's our mission statement. We want to create a nation full of first responders that after 20, 25, 30 years of service, you have the ability to retire if you want to or stay if you want to. But that decision is dictated based on your love of the job and not because we're chasing a pension. We got to work towards that ability to retire with dignity and enough money to last our entire life. That's the why. That's why we're here today, is understanding how those statistics impact our lives. And so now that we know a little bit about what we do as well as the why, we're going to shift into the first module where we start to get into the weeds of how do we start to build our financial strength.